All right. So last week we covered really Reb Moshe's emphasis and really sort of driving home the idea that a mechitza is not just a nice to have. It's not just a licharchila, but it is a mitzvah deraisa, and he goes to great lengths to prove that from the Gemara and Sukkah and both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and really sort of takes to task the other ways of looking at it to say that no, it's only a drabanan. So now what we'll do is we'll look at some of the as he develops this this tshuva, he'll get into more of what's some of the halachos, the gedorim around a mechitza, and he also gets into when a mechitza is required. So a lot of interesting ideas that are still sort of coming out in this tshuva. So we'll pick it up here, and I think this might be overlapped a little bit with last week, but that's okay. So he says, "Hayotzi mizeh, gam bebate kinesios shemiskabsin sham anoshim v'nashim lispalot tov yoser la'asos gezustra shehanashim yihiu lamala." So he says that just like again comparing it to, we learned from the Beis Hamikdash, that's where we know that they had this Ezra Nashim, the separation between men and women. And that they had created these balconies with the women on top, the men on the bottom, in order that there wouldn't be an intermingling. Because that's really what he was driving home, is that the point of this mechitza, or the point of the separation with the balcony, is to prevent the intermingling of men and women, which will lead to kalas rosh, to levity. So he says that even in our own shuls, the best architecture would be to also have a balcony similar to similar to the Beis Hamikdash, where the women would be on top. And if he says if you can't do that, your shul doesn't have a balcony at the top, then what you need is a real, he says, mechitza mamish. He seems to be saying, like, as opposed to some kind of simple separation, or maybe even nothing, just men on one side, women on the other, which is where the tshuva started. And he said, no, that's not enough. You can't simply separate men and women. You have to have this mechitza. Kazusha shetimna milavo lidei kalos rosh v'lo sagi b'ma she'nechshava mechitza l'cho davar kagon b'sha'arem psuchim k'ma she're'inu shelo ho'ilu b'mikdash v'haya asar midraisa. He says you can't just have something like maybe something that sort of signifies, maybe like some kind of a tsuras, a shar, like some kind of a an archway or something like that, where it's indicative that men are on one side and women on the other, but there's no physical barrier between them. He says you can't do that. Why? Because we saw even by the Beis Hamikdash that wasn't enough, right? We saw that they sort of went through stages of trying to put up some kind of a wall, trying to separate men on one side, women on the other, and they kept coming to the same conclusion, the same issue, that there was this intermingling. So, and he says that that's going to lead us to an Isra Midaraisa, even in our shuls. So lechein lo sagi gam b'mechitza shel asar tfachim mina karka, and something that's only 10 tfachim high, which is about a yard or 40 inches high, maybe like waist high or something like that, from the ground up. Sheina klum le'inin kalos rosh, but that isn't doing anything for you in terms of preventing this levity. Shahar yecholim ledaber laharbos sicha im hanashim, because you can easily talk over it and have an entire conversation with somebody who's on the other side of this short wall, b'lishum kushi, without anything that's interfering with you, lega biyadehem, and even to hold hands. Ve'ein lecha kalos rosh gedolim mizu, and that's sort of the definition of levity, right? Is that you're having a conversation, you're holding hands, like that's what we're trying to prevent. V'nechshavu k'mu'uravim mamish, and therefore, even though there's men on one side, women on the other, that would be considered to be an intermingling of men and women. So it doesn't necessarily mean that men and women have to actually be physically, all combined together. He says even if you have them on one side and the other, but there's a very short wall between them, that's considered to be an intermingling or mixing of men and women. V'asar medaraisa shegrua hi memechitza shevdila bein ezras nashim lechel b'mikdash. And because he said that that's actually even worse than what we saw again in the Gemara and Sukkah, where they were trying to build this mechitza and separating men and women, but because the Kohanim and Levim had to go through the ezras nashim, there was still this intermingling. So this wouldn't be any better than that. Certainly, it would be worse than that. Shulhawilan, it didn't help over in the Beis Hamikdash. It's not going to help here. Afsha Haisa Yoser Nikar, even though it was recognized, right? There was a recognized separation of men and women in the Beis Hamikdash even before they had built the balcony, but it wasn't enough. So Ela Tzrichim Masos Mechitza Gavoa B'mida Kazu Shelo Yavoli De Kalus Rosh. So therefore, you have to have a higher, and we're going to see what that means, but it has to be a taller mechitza than just something that's up to your waist. So it says, so what does it have to be? It has to be up to your shoulder height. Dehare chazinin shemechitza ena mitzad isur histaklus kedekosavti lael shezeh hare yadu gam mitchila. So there wasn't a problem. He says there wasn't a problem of men seeing women. That wasn't the issue, and therefore a mechitza that's up to your shoulders is going to be enough. V'yav achar hatikun hagadol lo nizkar shahayisa sham rak gezustra shahaya mikrashim munachim al hazizim habolatim, and he says that even after they made this great tikkun, as the Mishnah says, all we hear is that it's a balcony, and it wasn't like there was a balcony and a physical wall as well. So in other words, they could still see each other. The stam gezustra ain't a mechitza, right? A balcony. The term gezustra does not mean that there's like a big wall as well. It just means there's a balcony. So ayin erevin daf pizayit. So he goes through these different rayas to show us that it's out. We won't go into this too far because he's now going to get into the Rambam. We'll just take a look at his question, but we won't get too far into it. He says, "V'afsha Ramela Perush Mishnah Sukkah Sham Kosav Kadesh Lo Yistaklu Ha'anashim B'Anashim Ayim Sham." The Rambam does mention in his Perush to Mishnayos that the Gezustra was set up so the men wouldn't be looking at the women, but he goes to a lot of proofs to show that that's not you can't take that at face value because there's a lot of proofs from other places. He brings in a Mishnah from Midos where they talk about in the measurements of the Beis Hamikdash, etc. So he goes to great lengths to talk about that histaklus, even according to the Rambam, wasn't the necessary or wasn't the issue that they were really trying to prevent. It was really this, again, the levity. So I just want to skip down past that. Yeah, I mean, he's spending a lot of time. I'm just sort of looking through. I mean, this is all going through these different rayas where he's sort of showing that the Rambam can't be taken at face value. Okay, so after he does that, so he's really sort of proving that even according to the Rambam, his stockless isn't the issue. He says, "Ulechein b'mechitza gavoa ad achar haksafim shemistaber she'ein levo lidei kalas rosh." So therefore, he says that all you really need, and this is what he's saying, is that because histaklus is not an issue, having a mechitza that is shoulder height would be enough. Now, what is shoulder height? I mean, obviously, that's going to depend on the person. So what does that mean? He says, "V'hu gova gimel amos shehein yudches tfachim kid'isa b'shabes." So he's defining it as 3 amos, which is going to be about, this is going to be a 6 foot high mechitza. Now, we're going to see in a moment that shehein yudches tfachim kid'isa b'shabes ayin barashi v'tosvos sham v'tosvos erevin. Okay, so see what those measurements v'af. Rashba Sham She'im Haroshu Gimel Amos Yish Lahaka B'Yud Zayin Tfachim Shepachos Miyud Zayin Ushlish Yev Shar Kadesh Lo Yiksha Alav Mahad Shabbos Shemefurasham. So he's now we're starting to look at, without getting into all the sources, what these measurements should be. But let's just keep going a little bit further. Okay. right? So this is all going to be about 72 inches, again, about 6 feet. But so so he says that they have to be about shoulder height, although he's saying that it's 6 feet, which would be pretty high. And he says that if you do make the mechitza higher, so that you couldn't even see their heads, okay, tavu alei bracha. That's even probably even better. Maybe it's more mahudar. However, we want to describe it. It says befrat shaharbi nashi b'medina zu enam nizaros bekisrei rosh. Now this is an interesting part because it says there's another issue here, right? Histaklus shouldn't be a problem. But what if we have a situation where the women are coming in and they don't have their hair covered? So he says, Avaladina, yesh lahater gam b'gvor rak yud ches tfachim v'im shenitzos sham gam prui rosh. So what happens if it's, let's say, at this height, and you're going to see the women on the other side of the mechitza that don't have their hair covered? So kavar hora zakin bal orach hashulchan shebizman hazeh shebet avonosinu harabim yish harbe kemosan mutar lihispala kenegdan. So originally, I mean, if we go back many probably generations, maybe a couple of 100 years, where women would generally cover their hair. Even in the non-Jewish world, that was just something that women did. So when you had a situation where you had women not covering their hair, that's considered to be erva, and davening in front of such a woman would be a problem. But even in the times of the Aruch HaShulchan, which is the latter part of the 19th century, the Aruch HaShulchan he's quoting says that at that point they already had many women who were not covering their hair. It was very common, and therefore it was no longer an issue of erva, because I guess we get so used to it, I suppose, is the idea. And therefore, even according to the Aruch HaShulchan in his time, that to daven in front of women who don't have their hair covered is not a problem. So the Rav Moshe is quoting that and saying that would be. It sounds like that would not be a problem either. So he says limchos bepachos meyud chesfachim asur v'tzarich limchos b'chol tokif ki af im haya asur rak men rabbanan tzarich limchos koshakein shalin finas daiti hu midaraisa. So he says that we want to make sure that you have this mechitza that's high enough. If you can see women that have their hair uncovered, that's not going to be a problem. If you can make it higher, right, just to sort of sum up, right? If you can make it higher, he says that's certainly of a bracha. And certainly we see a lot of, depending on what shuls you go into, we certainly see different sizes and configurations of mechitzas that probably sort of fit in with different, these different ideas. Okay, but let's keep going forward because he's going to he's going to develop this even further. He says, "V'hine yesh makom lomar sharak b'mikdash haya asra midaraisa." He says, "No, maybe you're going to tell me there is really only the mikdash that is deraisa. Why was it? Like, what exactly makes it a deraisa?" He's already talked about earlier on that it was a deraisa that you have to make a mechitza because that was part of just the original, and we can see there's just from the Mishnayos that was part of the original intent. It was part of the original architecture anyway. It was part of that design. So that was one piece of what made it deraisa. But he's talking about it from another angle now. He's saying that why should it be a deraisa iser to not have a mechitza? And he says mishum din yira, that you have to have, there has to be an awe in us when we go into the Beis HaMikdash. Why? It says umikdashi tiro, and of my sanctuary, my holy place, you have to be in awe. You have to be, I'm not scared is probably not the word, but you have to have fear. You have to have yiras shamayim there. She'imhu bekalas rosh inu b'yira. So therefore, if you have kalas rosh, if you have levity is sort of the opposite of a feeling of awe, of a feeling of fear. And therefore, that's why it's going to be a deraisa iser to not have that mechitza in the Beis HaMikdash, because it's umikdashi tirau. V'imkein b'beichza knesses hu rak midrabanan. Maybe you're going to tell me, so maybe in our own shuls it's really only a drabanan because it's not the Beis HaMikdash. So asur gam behem kalas rosh v'lo. The rabbis would have also said can't have kalas rosh even in our shuls. Lo manigam tanai I am a Megillah Daf Kavches Shulchan Aruch. Okay. So he says, "V'koshakin lekalas rosh shel iser she'in moil ba t'nai aval b'shas hatfila ukishemazkirin sham shem shemayim v'divrei Torah kedusha mistaber shehu deraisa." But so again, he's really sort of pushing us in this direction that you're going to tell me it's Rabbanan. I'm going to tell you that there's too many rayas that make me feel like no, it's really a deraisa. He says anytime that we are being mazkir shem shemayim in our tefillas, and we're talking divrei Torah. And there's kedusha. So she says it's mistaber shehu deraisa shahalo kedusha shetiknu bebeisa knesses because of her rabba megillah daf chavav shubishum sheikaru asur lo marbo davar shebekedusha ayin sham. So and what he's driving to us now is that that our shuls become mikdash ma'at, and everything that we do in them is kadosh. This is he's quoting this Ram. So v'im divrei hakadosha atzman ein bahem dini hakadusha lo hayashayach letakin kedusha al beis haknesses b'shvalam achein mashma shebe'eis hatfila harihu bedini kedusha midaraisa v'hiya asra linhag bo kalas rosh betfila midaraisa. He says that in the times of when we have in the time of tefillah, we're in shul to daven, that is a time of kedusha, and therefore it's going to have an isra deraisa. Now, what's interesting about our shuls, and I think what he's sort of implying here, is that what happens when you are in shul, but it's not a time of tefillah. Let's say it's a bris milah. Let's say it's a wedding, right? It's a bar mitzvah party. Not the actual davening part. It's something else. Then it could be that Kaddish Rosh would be okay, meaning that we don't have to be as concerned. Whereas in the Beis HaMikdash, it seems like it doesn't matter what's going on in the Beis HaMikdash at that moment. There's this idea of umikdashit tira'u that may not be applicable in shul 24/7. It might only be true at specific times, maybe when there's shiurim as well, because that's also kedusha of divrei Torah. But it seems like that's maybe a chiluk that he's making in our shuls, is that there might be moments when the idea of umikdashit tira'u may not apply. Okay. I just want to move down a little bit just so we can finish this up. So he says, I'm just looking for that spot where he moves on this. Okay, sorry. Right over here. He says, "Aval muchrachim k'tzas lomar shedin zehu midaraisa b'chol makom kibbutz shehare hahesped shela asid shel melamdim misham lo matzenu bo shehiyeh b'mikdash." Then he says, and it's almost like he's, it's almost like, in his mind he's developing the idea, because now he's sort of backtracking a little bit and saying, okay, but wait a second. He says, but we might need to say muchrachim k'tzas. We might need to say that it's even a din deraisa of not having, of a mechitza of not having kalas rosh. He says anytime we have a kibbutz, anytime that we have a gathering of men and women together. Why does he say that? He says shaharei hahesped. The beginning, just jumping back up in a moment in our heads when Reb Moshe was talking about learning out this Gemara with us. So the Gemara says, or the Gemara asks the question, how could you change the configuration of the Beis HaMikdash? It was all biksav. It was all, taught to us from the Nevi'im through Ruach HaKodesh. Like we can't change it. And so the Gemara answers and says, no, I have a raya why it's still within the Ksav, because of the pasuk, the Maisa in the Navi Zechariah, where it talks about there's a spadim going on, it's the Levaya, and it's a machlokas as to whose Levaya it is, but it's a Levaya la'asu lavo, it's in days to come, and we see that in the Psukim that they separated men and women, and that was in the times of Hesped, in times of a Levaya. So he says that's not in shul, and that's Hesped. Hesped is not necessarily divrei kedusha. It's really not divrei tefillah. So he says shahare hesped shalasid shalamdi misham lo matzanu bo shehiyeh b'mikdash. That was in a cemetery. That wasn't or wherever it was, but it certainly wasn't in the Beis HaMikdash that was taking place. So the im sham lo nasar midaraisa ella litznius v'alma. therefore, if we're only sort of separating ourselves because it's tznius, or we're separating men and women, so and if you're going to tell me, well, they only separated for the haspedim tznius because it was the right thing to do, whatever, however you want to tell me, and you want to tell me it wasn't a deraisa, well, then how do we learn it from there back to the Beis Hamikdash? That's why we were able to change the configuration of the Beis Hamikdash. That doesn't seem to work. Elamashma shehu iser b'chol makom shetzrichim hikabetz bo anashim v'nashim. So he says that this is that it seems to be mistaver that anytime we're going to have a congregation or a gathering of men and women together, shesum lihiyos below hevdal mechitza beineim. You're always going to have a mechitza between them. Kadei shelo yavoli dei kalas rosh. Ach ulai afshe behefsed yihiyeh letznius be'omahu akoponim raya sheish b'zeh inin kalas rosh lechen yesh le'eser b'mikdash midaraisa mishum mitzvahs yira. V'yihiyeh bebeis haKnesses midrabanu b'shasat tefillah deraisa avol yosi mistarashu midaraisa b'komakom kibbutz. He said that it is possible that you could say maybe it's only if it's tznius that they do it there, but we're going to learn that to the Beis Hamikdash where it would be deraisa because of the mitzvah of yira that is taking place in the Beis Hamikdash, or that is chal in the Beis Hamikdash, isn't chal other places, and in our Beis haKnesses then it would only be drabanan that we have to avoid, or we have to have yira. But then at the time of tefillah, then it becomes deraisa, as he said earlier above, where it says anytime you have kedusha. So it seems like what he's saying is that on the one hand, you might say, and he seems to feel more comfortable in saying it's always deraisa, but he also seems to leave open the idea that maybe if it's not during the time of davening or maybe a shir in Torah, maybe at that point it's only derabanan. Maybe it's that the chiyuv becomes less. At the time, again, he seems to feel more comfortable. He says, "Avo yoser mistaver shehu midaraisa b'komakom kibbutz." And just to finish this off, below tzorech kibbutz apamikdash mutar shahare chana hispalo samuch la'eli and interesting. He says that even in the Beis Hamikdash, if you don't have a kibbutz, you don't have all the men and women coming together because it's Yontif, right? What's the case? Chana is davening in Shiloh. It's a predecessor to the Beis Hamikdash, but it still has the same kedusha. She's davening there, and she's next to Eli. Eli is watching her do this. There's no mechitza, there's no, right? So why is that? Well, because there's no kibbutz, is what he says. Okay, so we have, he says, different rayas of when individuals, and we have individual women who might be davening and there's no mechitza, but he says once you have a kibbutz, that's when you have a chiyuv of a mechitza. And just to end and sort of think this out a little bit, you can see like sometimes, and it really depends, different communities for like weddings, for instance, right? You have some weddings that there's separation at certain times, certainly during dancing, but even right, some weddings that you might go to, there could be a separation even during the seuda between men and women. And now it seems like that would fit in with what Reb Moshe is saying. That's probably what they're holding like, is that, according to Reb Moshe, anytime you have a kibbutz of men and women together, you have to have a mechitza. Some of the, I think that I've heard like, some of the yeshiva annual dinners, right? You'll find that there's a mechitza there the entire time. So it certainly is going to depend. But we can see is that this is where probably all coming from Reb Moshe in terms of understanding it. Does every kibbutz require a mechitza or not? But we also saw that according to him, even our mechitzas that we have, they're really just to prevent the intermingling. Seeing men and women is not a problem, even when the women are not covering their heads. It's not a problem, according to all the way back to the times of the Aruch HaShulchan. So at this point, we've got like a pretty good idea of like what are some of the parameters, the gedarim of what a mechitza is, what's the source of the requirement of the mechitza and the necessity for it. So hopefully it's given us more of an insight as to why we have a mechitza and the parameters of what the mechitza is supposed to be accomplishing.
How does he define kibbutz? How many people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. That's a good question. How many people do you need to make it into a kibbutz? He doesn't define it. So yeah, again, it's all those kinds of things that it's not. It's there's certainly, and we see in our communities, like different communities certainly look at it a little bit differently. And even I think even in when you think about like shiva homes, right? We don't think about that as a kibbutz that's going to lead to Kalos Rosh. I mean, I personally have never seen even in very frum shiva houses a mechitza up. Usually just women will sort of back away in terms of at times of davening, back away maybe into the back of the room or into a next room, but not necessarily with a mechitza up. So yeah, it's a good question as to when is it required, when is it not required. That would require probably a little bit more a little bit more research and a few more sources to look at. But yeah, good question.